See, while waiting in line at a downtown coffee shop, a stranger tapped my shoulder and mentioned, I looked exactly like her sister. I smiled politely until she whispered that her sister vanished 25 years ago. My blood froze. I nervously asked for the missing girl's name. The stranger stared directly into my eyes and replied, Maya. That is my name. I am Maya. I am 33 years old and a senior financial auditor. For my entire life, I believed I was the biological daughter of Brenda, a devout church-going woman who demanded perfection and ruled our home with an iron fist. But in one single moment, a spilled cup of coffee and a whispered name shattered my entire reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your entire world turned upside down by a family secret. As a financial auditor, my brain is wired to look for discrepancies. I deal in hard facts, spreadsheets, and verified records. I do not deal well with unpredictable emotional outbursts or dramatic scenes. But when the woman standing in front of me dropped her iced latte, shattering the plastic cup across the tile floor, my analytical mind completely short-circuited. Her name was Chloe. She was shaking violently, her hands covering her mouth as she looked at my face. She pulled a crumpled, faded photograph from her wallet and shoved it into my trembling hands. It was a picture of a little girl with a bright yellow ribbon in her hair. The resemblance was not just close. It was a perfect mirror image of my own childhood photos. Chloe choked back a loud sob and said, You have the exact same birthmark on your left collarbone. I instinctively reached up and touched the small crescent-shaped mark on my skin. Panic clawed at my throat. I told her she was mistaken. I told her my mother was Brenda, and we had lived in the same neighborhood my entire life. But Chloe shook her head and stepped closer. She said, Our family hired a nanny 25 years ago. The nanny took my baby sister to the park one sunny afternoon, and they never came back. The nanny's name was Brenda. I could not breathe. The walls of the coffee shop felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. I dropped the photograph onto the counter, turned around, and ran out the door. I ignored Chloe frantically calling out my name behind me. I practically threw myself into my car, locking the doors tightly, as if I could somehow lock out the terrifying truth. My hands trembled so violently, I could barely put the key in the ignition. Everything I knew about my life suddenly felt like a massive, calculated lie. Every single time Brenda had refused to show me my original birth certificate, claiming it was ruined in a basement flood. Every time she had coldly deflected my questions about who my father was. Every time she had treated me more like a lucrative financial asset than a loving daughter. Always demanding a large portion of my paycheck to fund my older brother's endless failed business ventures. It all suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. My brain raced through decades of memories, highlighting every inconsistency, every lie, and every moment of emotional abuse. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. I did not care about the speed limit or the blaring horns around me. I drove straight toward the affluent suburban neighborhood where Brenda lived. The house I grew up in was a beautiful brick colonial maintained by my hard work and the constant loans I provided just to keep the family afloat. As I pulled into the wide circular driveway, I saw 3 luxury cars parked out front. Brenda was hosting her weekly afternoon tea party for the prominent wealthy women of our church. Normally, I would never dare interrupt her precious social gatherings. Brenda hated anything that made her look less than perfect in front of her elite congregation. She cared about her public image more than she cared about anything else in the world. But today, the strict rules of polite society did not matter to me at all. I was no longer the obedient daughter trying to earn her conditional love. I threw my car into park, leaving the engine running loudly in the driveway. I marched up the long brick walkway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not even bother knocking on the pristine white door. I grabbed the heavy brass handle, twisted it hard, and pushed the massive front door open with loud force. The heavy wooden door crashed against the wall, echoing through the immaculate foyer. The soft chatter died instantly. I stepped into the parlor, still breathing heavily. The room was filled with the most influential women from our church. First Lady Higgins and a dozen others sat balancing delicate porcelain teacups on their knees. Brenda sat at the head of the room, wearing a tailored pastel suit, looking every bit the perfect devoted matriarch. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting to my disheveled appearance. I did not care about the audience. I walked straight up to her coffee table, ignoring the shocked gasps from the church elders. I looked Brenda dead in the eye and demanded to know about the baby girl she took from Atlanta 25 years ago. I demanded to know why a stranger named Chloe just handed me a photograph that looked exactly like me. I asked her to tell me my real name. The room fell into a suffocating silence. I expected Brenda to panic. I expected her to cry, or confess, or show some sign of guilt. But she did not flinch. She gracefully placed her teacup onto its saucer, looking at me with a perfectly crafted expression of sorrow and pity. She turned to the church ladies and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. She apologized to her guests, saying my 100-hour work weeks had finally broken my mind. I stood stunned as she skillfully wove a narrative of my supposed mental collapse. She reached out to gently stroke my arm, speaking in a sickeningly sweet tone, meant for a toddler. She told me I needed to go back to the hospital and get my medication adjusted. I stepped back, refusing her touch. I tried to explain about the photograph, but my voice shook, making me sound exactly like the hysterical woman she was painting me to be. That is when Jessica walked in from the kitchen, carrying a silver tray of freshly baked scones. Jessica is my brother Marcus' white wife. She is a petite blonde woman who perfected the art of weaponizing her fragility. Wearing a floral apron, she rushed over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders in a fake show of comfort. Jessica looked around the room to ensure every elder was paying attention before delivering her calculated blow. She told me to calm down and take a deep breath. We all know you are stressed because Marcus asked you for a $50,000 loan to save his startup company. But you do not need to invent a fake kidnapping story just to avoid helping your brother out of a financial bind. The words hit me like a punch. She had effortlessly twisted my discovery into a selfish attempt to hoard my money. The church ladies immediately began whispering to one another, their eyes filled with harsh judgment. First Lady Higgins loudly muttered, "It was a terrible shame how extremely selfish the younger generation had become, after all the sacrifices Brenda made." Brenda dabbed her dry eyes, playing the suffering martyr flawlessly. Jessica stood beside her, rubbing Brenda's back and glaring at me with a triumphant smirk. They had me completely cornered. If I kept yelling, I would only prove their narrative that I was mentally unstable. If I ran out, I would look guilty of abandoning my family over money. I was entirely isolated, standing alone in the middle of the only close community I had ever known, deeply realizing that not a single person in this entire room would believe my truth over Brenda's carefully constructed lies. The anger burning in my chest slowly began to change shape. The panicked inner child who just wanted her mother to explain the truth retreated deep inside my mind. My professional instincts finally kicked in. I am a senior financial auditor. I spend my life dismantling complex corporate frauds, finding the hidden numbers that liars try to bury. I looked at Brenda dabbing her fake tears and Jessica holding her tray of baked goods. The panic completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that arguing with them in a room full of their loyal supporters was a losing battle. I needed hard, undeniable evidence. I needed absolute proof. I needed receipts. I forced my face to go completely blank. I stopped shaking. I looked at Brenda and calmly apologized for interrupting her lovely tea party. I told her she was right and that I was just exhausted. I turned around and walked up the carpeted stairs toward my childhood bedroom, leaving them to their whispers. I knew what I had to do next. I needed a DNA sample, and I knew exactly where Brenda kept her favorite wooden hairbrush hidden in the bathroom. I slipped quietly down the hallway toward the master bedroom. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew every creak of the floorboards in this house, so I carefully avoided the loose plank near the guest room. I reached Brenda's bedroom door and pushed it open. The room smelled of expensive lavender perfume and bleach, just like it always did. I moved quickly to the adjoining master bathroom. Stepping onto the plush white rug, I opened the second drawer of the oak vanity, where I knew she kept her expensive wooden hairbrush. My hands were shaking as I pulled the brush out under the harsh bathroom lights. I expected to find a tangle of her dark coarse hair threaded through the bristles. I just needed one good strand with the root intact to take to a private lab. But as I turned the brush over in my hands, my stomach completely dropped. The brush was absolutely spotless. It had been scrubbed clean, not a single strand of hair or speck of dust remained. I frantically pulled open the other drawers, checking her combs, her hot tools, and even the bathroom trash. Can. Everything was meticulously emptied and wiped down with bleach. She knew I was coming. She had sterilized her own bathroom before the tea party even started. Brenda was always 10 steps ahead, and she was sending me a silent, terrifying message that I would not win this game. I carefully placed the wooden brush exactly where I found it and backed out of the room. I sneaked down the back staircase, slipping out the side door without anyone in the parlor noticing. I drove back to my own apartment in a daze. I spent the entire night pacing my living room floor, staring at the photograph Chloe had given me. The little girl with the yellow ribbon stared back at me. I could not sleep a single wink. My mind raced with questions about who my real family was and what Brenda had done 25 years ago. When the sun finally rose, I decided I needed to stick to my normal routine to keep from completely losing my mind. I put on my workout clothes and walked down the street to my regular coffee shop. I needed caffeine to function, and I needed a moment of normalcy. I stood in line and ordered my usual black coffee, handing my debit card to the young cashier. He swiped the card through the machine and frowned. The machine let out a loud, sharp beep. The cashier looked up and apologized, saying the card was declined. I felt a flush of embarrassment and quickly pulled out my backup credit card. I handed it to him, confident. This was just a minor bank glitch. He swiped the second card. The machine beeped again. Declined. He handed the card back with a sympathetic look, telling me I should probably call my bank. I stepped out of the line, my face burning as the people behind me let out impatient sighs. I walked out to my car, clutching my empty hands. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my phone, logging directly into my secure banking portal. The screen loaded and a massive red banner flashed across the top of my dashboard. It read, "Account frozen, due to suspected fraud. Please contact branch manager." I refreshed the page, thinking it must be an error, but the red banner remained. My checking account, my savings account, and even my emergency credit lines were completely locked out. My available balance across all accounts showed a terrifying 0. I clicked on the Details tab, trying to find the source of the hold. There was a note attached to the freeze indicating the account was flagged by an authorized family member for my own protection. Brenda, she had used her status as an authorized signer on my oldest college checking account to trigger a global freeze on my entire financial portfolio. She was cutting off my resources to force me into submission. Panic threatened to rise in my chest again. But then something else took over. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. When I opened them, the scared daughter was gone. I am a senior financial auditor. I track missing millions for massive corporations. I expose offshore accounts and dismantle complex financial crimes for a living. Brenda thought freezing my money would make me helpless. She thought treating me like a naive child would force me to run back to her begging for forgiveness. But she made a fatal miscalculation. She had just brought a financial war to an expert. I did not cry. I did not scream. I set my phone down and started the car. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank downtown. The morning traffic was heavy, but my mind was entirely focused on the upcoming confrontation. I parked my car in the visitor lot and walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank. The cool air conditioning hit my face as I approached the front desk. I calmly presented my identification and asked to speak directly with the branch manager. A few minutes later, I was escorted into a private glass-walled office. Mr. Henderson, a middle-aged man I had dealt with for several years, sat behind a large mahogany desk. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him and asked him to explain exactly why my entire financial portfolio was currently frozen. Mr. Henderson looked incredibly uncomfortable. He adjusted his glasses and nervously clicked his mouse, pulling up my personal financial file on his computer monitor. He cleared his throat and told me that earlier this morning a family member who is an authorized signer on my oldest college checking account flagged the entire profile. He said they submitted a formal notice claiming I was mentally unstable and a severe danger to my own finances. My mother had intentionally abused a banking loophole designed to protect the elderly and vulnerable from financial exploitation. I opened my mouth to explain that I was perfectly fine and that this was a highly malicious tactic designed to control me. But before I could speak a single word, the heavy glass door of the office swung open. Marcus and Jessica walked right in. Their arrival was entirely too perfect. They had obviously been waiting in the bank parking lot for me to show up. Marcus wore a perfectly pressed navy suit looking exactly like the responsible, concerned older brother. Jessica rushed forward immediately. Her eyes were already brimming with fresh, dramatic tears. She placed a trembling, delicate hand on Mr. Henderson's desk and began her calculated performance. She introduced herself as my loving sister-in-law and told the bank manager how deeply heartbroken our entire family was today. Jessica unleashed a massive flood of tears, weeping openly about how hard they were trying to save me from myself. She told Mr. Henderson that I had suffered a severe psychotic break the day before, during a family gathering. She claimed I was running around the neighborhood telling people I was kidnapped as a baby and that my devoted mother was secretly a master criminal. She choked back a loud theatrical sob and said they just wanted to make absolutely sure I did not drain my entire life savings in a state of sheer dangerous delusion. It was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. Jessica weaponized her tears perfectly, using her perceived fragility to completely control the narrative in the room. I watched Mr. Henderson's posture shift immediately. The professional courtesy he had shown me just moments ago completely vanished into thin air. He leaned forward, offering Jessica a box of tissues from his desk with a soft, comforting smile. He looked at her with deep sympathy, and then looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and cautious fear. He told Jessica that the bank took severe mental health crises very seriously and assured her the financial freeze would remain strictly in place until a licensed medical professional officially cleared me. Marcus stood right behind his weeping wife, placing a gentle, comforting hand on her shoulder. He looked down at me with an incredibly smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. They had set the absolute perfect trap. They knew my personality better than anyone. They knew I was fiercely independent and that my money was the one thing I controlled completely without their interference. They fully expected me to lose my temper right then and there. They desperately wanted me to stand up and shout. They wanted me to point my finger directly in Jessica's face and loudly call her a liar. They were waiting for me to raise my voice so they could point at me and show the bank manager the angry, unhinged black woman they claimed I was. If I reacted with even a tiny fraction of the raging anger burning inside my chest, I would give them exactly the visual proof they needed to justify the account freeze forever. I realized in that exact moment that absolute silence was my most powerful weapon. I refused to play the demeaning role they had carefully written for me. I did not raise my voice at all. I did not defend myself to a man who had already firmly made up his mind. I simply stood up, smoothed my jacket, and calmly walked right out of the quiet room, leaving them both staring completely confused behind me. I walked out of the bank, leaving them both staring completely confused behind me. I did not look back. I got into my car and drove straight to my apartment, locking the deadbolt the second I was inside. I closed all the blinds in my living room. The silence of my apartment was exactly what I needed right now. I went to my home office and booted up my custom-built desktop computer. This was my domain. As a senior financial auditor, I had access to enterprise-level forensic software that the average person did not even know existed. I connected to a secure encrypted virtual private network and bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus. Experian and Equifax only show what the retail banks want you to see. I needed the raw historical data hidden beneath the surface. I opened my specialized forensic tracing application and typed my social security number into the search field. I set the search parameters to include every single financial transaction linked to my identity since the exact day I was born. The loading bar crawled slowly across the screen, while the cooling fans in my computer whirred loudly. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the lines of code and financial data populate the black screen. Hundreds of records appeared. My student loans, my car payments, my old college checking account, and my current mortgage all scrolled past. I filtered out all the known accounts to isolate any anomalies. The screen went blank for a fraction of a second before a single encrypted file appeared. It was a ghost file, a highly secure trust fund established exactly 25 years ago in Atlanta, Georgia. My heart started beating violently against my ribs. I clicked on the ghost file, forcing the software to decrypt the basic ledger. The trust fund was registered under my social security number, but it was legally structured to remain completely hidden from standard credit reports until my 35th birthday. I scrolled down to the transaction history. My breath caught in my throat. On the first day of every single month. For the last 25 years, exactly $10,000 had been withdrawn from the trust. I pulled up the calculator application on my second monitor. $10,000 a month, multiplied by 12 months, was $120,000 a year. Multiply that by 25 years. $3 million. Someone had systematically drained $3 million from a trust fund in my name, while I spent my entire young adult life working exhausting double shifts just to pay my way through college. While Brenda constantly guilt-tripped me into paying her household bills and funding Marcus and his lavish lifestyle, someone was quietly stealing a massive fortune meant for me. I needed to know exactly where that money was going. I ran a deep trace on the destination routing number attached to the monthly withdrawals. The software tracked the money as it bounced through a complicated web of shell corporations. It was a highly sophisticated laundering technique designed to confuse standard tax audits. But I was not a standard auditor. I tracked the digital footprints through a dummy corporation in Delaware, and then across the border to an offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. I initiated a backdoor ping to request the signatory details on that offshore account. The system processed the request for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a single name populated in bright white letters across my dark monitor. Brenda. The offshore account belonged entirely to my mother, the woman who claimed to have rescued me and raised me as her own. The woman who just froze my legitimate bank accounts claiming I was mentally unstable. The horrifying truth hit me with the force of a massive freight train. Brenda did not just kidnap me out of some twisted maternal desire for a child. She kidnapped me for a guaranteed paycheck. She had discovered the trust fund set up by my wealthy biological family, and she had spent my entire life using my existence as her own personal ATM machine. I was never her beloved daughter. I was a hostage generating a six-figure annual salary. My sadness instantly vanished. The little girl who desperately wanted her mother's love was officially dead. In her place sat a highly trained financial auditor who had just uncovered a massive multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy. I reached for my phone and opened my encrypted messaging application. I needed to reconnect with the stranger from the coffee shop immediately. Chloe was the only person who held physical puzzle pieces to match my digital evidence. I typed out a secret message asking to meet at a secure location away from prying eyes. I sent an encrypted message to the number Chloe scribbled on a receipt yesterday. I told her to meet me at a small library outside of town. It had private study rooms where no one would overhear our conversation. I packed my laptop and drove there, making sure I was not followed. I secured a private room, locking the heavy door behind me. When there was a soft knock on the door, I opened it to find Chloe standing there. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, but she held a thick manila folder tightly against her chest. I invited her in, and we sat opposite each other at a small oak table. The silence between us was heavy. Yesterday, I ran away because the truth was too painful to process. Today, I was a woman on a mission seeking the final pieces of a horrific puzzle. I calmly opened my laptop and turned the glowing screen toward her, showing her the offshore account details and the monthly $10,000 withdrawals. I explained how my bank accounts were frozen this morning by the woman I thought was my mother. Chloe looked at the screen and let out a gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. She told me our biological parents were wealthy real estate developers living in Atlanta. When I was born, they set up a massive trust fund in my given name. She opened the thick manila folder and slid it across the wooden table toward me. It was an official police file from the Atlanta Police Department dated exactly 25 years ago. The paper was yellowed and smelled like stale dust. Inside was a missing persons report. The name printed on the file was Maya Caldwell. I traced my fingers over the typed letters, feeling a strange sense of cold detachment. Chloe pulled out a photograph from the folder and placed it gently in front of me. It was a picture of me as a toddler wearing a bright yellow sundress sitting on the lap of a young woman. The young woman had a wide smile, but her dark eyes were cold and calculating. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sudden violent rush. It was Brenda. She looked 25 years younger, but there was absolutely no mistaking those sharp cheekbones and that rigid posture. Chloe explained that Brenda was hired through an elite agency to be my full-time nanny. She worked for the family for 6 months, earning their complete and total trust. Then, one afternoon, she took me for a walk to the botanical gardens and simply never returned. The police searched for months, but Brenda had meticulously erased her entire identity before taking me. She moved across the country, forged new documents, and assumed a brand new life. I stared at the photograph of the woman who forced me to call her mother. The final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with absolute sickening clarity. Brenda never loved me. She never even wanted to be a mother. I was nothing more than a stolen asset. I was a lucrative financial investment she had successfully harvested for 25 long years. She knew that even though she stole me, she could still secretly siphon off the trust fund my grieving parents had established by slowly laundering the money through shell companies using my stolen social security number. The realization washed over me like freezing ice water. Every punishment I endured as a child, every time she withheld affection, every time she demanded I pay her bills, it was all part of a calculated business transaction. I was living, breathing ransom money. I looked up from the photograph and met Chloe's eyes. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, holding it tightly. She told me our father died of a massive heart attack 10 years ago, never giving up the search for me. She said our mother was still alive, but her health was failing from decades of endless grief. They spent millions hiring private investigators, but Brenda had buried us way too deep. Until yesterday, when Chloe was visiting town for a corporate conference and happened to walk into that downtown coffee shop to get a latte. Fate had finally caught up with Brenda. I gently pulled my hand back from Chloe and slowly closed the manila folder. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of Brenda's impending legal destruction. I told Chloe to pack up her files and get her car ready. We had a lot of hard work to do, and I needed to prepare the absolute perfect trap for the criminals who stole my entire life. I walked out of the library with a clear mind and a cold determination. I hugged Chloe goodbye in the parking lot, promising her that I would be in touch very soon. I climbed into my sedan and gripped the steering wheel, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in 33 years, I finally knew exactly who I was. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the main road, heading back toward my apartment to begin drafting my master plan. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I was mentally calculating the exact federal statutes for wire fraud when I noticed a police cruiser pull up closely behind me. I checked my speedometer, confirming I was driving exactly the legal limit. I kept my eyes forward, but a few seconds later, the cruiser's lights flared to life. Red and blue flashes filled my rearview mirror. I calmly signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road, expecting a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight or an expired tag. But before I could even shift the car into park, two more police cruisers aggressively swerved in front of me, blocking my path entirely. My heart slammed against my ribs. Another cruiser pulled up, blocking me from the left. I was completely boxed in. Suddenly, the doors of the cruisers burst open, and four officers stepped out. They immediately drew their weapons, pointing them directly at my windshield. A loud voice boomed over a megaphone, commanding me to turn off the engine, drop the keys out the window, and place my hands flat against the glass. The air in the car suddenly felt incredibly thin. Every single survival instinct I had developed as a Black woman in America kicked in at once. I knew exactly how quickly a situation like this could escalate into a deadly tragedy. One sudden movement, one perceived threat, and my life could end right here on the side of a suburban road. I forced my breathing to slow down. I moved with exaggerated, agonizing slowness. I turned the key, dropped it out the open window, and pressed my palms flat against the inside of the windshield. The cold glass grounded me. The officer with the megaphone ordered me to step out of the vehicle with my hands raised high in the air. I pushed the door open with my elbow and stepped out onto the rough pavement. The blinding glare of the police lights made it hard to see their faces, but the black barrels of their guns were impossible to miss. They yelled contradictory commands, telling me to walk backward toward the sound of their voices while keeping my hands up. I followed their instructions perfectly, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. When I reached the back of my car, an officer grabbed my arms roughly, pulling them behind my back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit sharply into my wrists, clicking tightly into place. Another officer shoved me downward, forcing me onto my knees on the hard asphalt. The small gravel stones dug into my skin, but I did not make a sound. I looked up at the officer standing over me and politely asked why I was being arrested with such extreme force. He stared down at me with a hard expression and informed me that they had received a priority call about a stolen vehicle. He said the suspect was considered a flight risk and potentially unstable. I told him there must be a massive mistake because I purchased this car 3 years ago and I had the registration in the glove compartment. The officer shook his head and pulled a notepad from his chest pocket. He said the vehicle was legally reported stolen just an hour ago by the registered CO signer. I asked him who filed the report, even though I already knew the answer deep in my gut. The officer looked at his notes and read the name aloud: Marcus. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it struck me like a physical blow. Marcus had used the financial freeze Brenda initiated to exploit a technicality on my car loan, claiming ownership and reporting it stolen. But this was not just a legal maneuver to take my car. Marcus is a Black man. He knows exactly what happens when police draw their weapons on a suspect. He knows the sheer terror of staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. He weaponized the police against his own sister, hoping the sheer terror of a high-risk traffic stop would break my spirit. He wanted me crying on the pavement, begging for my family to save me. As I kneeled there on the side of the road with red and blue lights flashing across my face, the last tiny shred of familial obligation I held on to burned away into ash. They did not just want to steal my money, they wanted to destroy my life. The police pulled me up by my arms and shoved me into the back of the cruiser. I did not resist. I leaned my head against the plastic partition and stared out the window. Marcus had just pushed me past the point of no return. The ride to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and suffocating silence. The officers pulled me out of the cruiser and marched me through the brightly lit precinct. They emptied my pockets, took my shoelaces, and locked me inside a small concrete holding cell. The air smelled of stale sweat. I sat down on the hard metal bench and stared at the gray wall. I did not cry. I did not ask for a phone call. I simply waited. My mind was rapidly running through the legal implications of a stolen vehicle charge when the heavy steel door finally clicked open. A young police officer stepped aside to let 4 people enter the cramped room. Brenda walked in first, wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit and a deeply disappointed expression. Marcus followed closely behind her, puffing out his chest to appear larger. Jessica trailed them, wiping away imaginary tears from her pale cheeks. The 4th person was a man I did not recognize. He wore a sleek, expensive gray suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase. He had the polished, arrogant look of a high-priced defense attorney. Brenda looked around the dirty holding cell and let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, manufactured pity. She shook her head and told me it broke her heart to see me sitting in a cage like a common criminal. I remained perfectly silent, staring at her with cold, blank eyes. Marcus stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me I had really crossed the line this time. He said stealing a car was a felony and police were preparing to transfer me to jail. Jessica chimed in right on cue, letting out a soft, dramatic sob. She pressed her hands to her chest and begged me to please just let them help me. She told me my mental health was rapidly deteriorating, and this entire terrible situation was just a massive cry for help. It was almost impressive how seamlessly they worked together to build their false narrative. They convinced themselves I was entirely at their mercy. The lawyer stepped forward and placed his leather briefcase on the metal table. He popped the latches open and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He introduced himself as a senior partner at a local law firm. He looked at me with a condescending smile and explained my loving family retained his services to save me from prison. He pushed the documents across the table toward me along with a silver pen. He told me Marcus agreed to drop the grand theft auto charges. The police would release me immediately and my record would remain clean. I would be free to walk out of the precinct tonight. But there was one specific condition. The lawyer tapped his manicured finger on the top page of the thick document. He explained that my family was deeply concerned about my recent psychotic break and my inability to make rational choices. In order to drop the criminal charges, I simply needed to sign a medical and financial power of attorney. The document would grant Marcus full legal authority over my healthcare decisions and complete unrestricted access to all of my personal financial assets. They were holding my freedom hostage in exchange for the total surrender of my entire life. Marcus leaned over the table, getting dangerously close to my face. He told me this was my only way out. He said if I refused to sign, he would press charges to the fullest extent of the law. He promised I would lose my corporate auditing job, my apartment, and my entire future over a felony conviction. I looked from Marcus to Brenda, and finally down at the stack of papers. I picked up the document and read. I did not skim the pages like a frightened victim. I read them with the sharp, meticulous focus of a senior financial auditor. I ignored their impatient sighs as I turned each page, analyzing every single legal clause. The document was incredibly broad and aggressive. It granted Marcus the immediate right to liquidate my bank accounts, sell my physical property, and most importantly, access any trust funds held in my legal name. It let him commit me to a psychiatric facility without consent. My eyes locked onto a specific clause buried within the 3rd page. The clause explicitly authorized Marcus to execute wire transfers across state lines. It granted him the ability to prematurely dissolve any long-term trusts. My mind immediately raced back to the hidden trust fund in Atlanta. The pieces of their sinister puzzle were snapping together. They did not just want to control me, They needed immediate access to liquid cash. The pieces of their sinister puzzle were snapping together. They did not just want to control me, they needed immediate access to liquid cash. I knew I had to play the exact part they expected from a broken, defeated woman. I forced a ragged breath and let my shoulders slump forward. I blinked hard, squeezing out a few strategic tears that rolled slowly down my cheeks. Jessica let out a soft, satisfied sigh, seeing my apparent surrender. But behind my wet eyes, my mind was operating with the cold, calculating precision of a supercomputer. I dragged my finger down the heavy cardstock of the legal document, pretending to struggle with the complex legal jargon, while rapidly decoding their entire financial strategy. The power of attorney was specifically structured with emergency expedition clauses. These clauses were designed to bypass standard judicial review periods, typically required for taking over an adult dependent's finances. Why the sudden desperate rush? Why orchestrate this elaborate theater of a stolen car and a jail cell just to force a signature? Tonight. The timeline was the key. Marcus had launched a flashy tech startup 2 years ago. He hosted lavish launch parties, rented a premium downtown office space, and bought Jessica a brand new imported luxury SUV. He bragged constantly about his elite private investors, but my auditor instincts had always warned me his numbers were completely fabricated. Legitimate venture capitalists demand board seats and rigorous quarterly audits. Marcus never produced a single viable commercial product. His elite investors were not Wall Street bankers. They were underground loan sharks, violent, dangerous people who dealt in hard cash, exorbitant interest rates, and broken bones. Marcus was drowning in a massive illicit debt, and the grace period had clearly expired. He was terrified. That explained the cold sweat beating on his forehead despite the freezing air of the holding cell. It explained why Brenda was suddenly willing to risk exposing her 25-year kidnapping secret by aggressively freezing my retail bank accounts. They were completely out of time and out of options. They needed a massive injection of capital immediately, and they knew exactly where to find it. I thought back to the ghost file I discovered on my encrypted software earlier today. The trust fund established by my biological parents in Atlanta was designed to pay out a $10,000 monthly stipend. But standard generational wealth trusts always have a maturity date. A specific age when the beneficiary gains full, unrestricted access to the entire principal amount. I am 33 years old. Most major high net worth trust funds unseal the principal at age 35. I did the math in my head. The principal balance of a trust that generated that kind of monthly interest for 2 full decades would easily exceed $5 million. Marcus and Brenda could not wait 2 more years for me to naturally inherit the money. The loan sharks would end his life long before my 35th birthday. They needed a legal backdoor to crack the trust fund open right now. This power of attorney was that exact backdoor. By declaring me legally incompetent and mentally unstable, Marcus would become my official state-appointed financial guardian. With this document, he could petition the financial institution in Atlanta to liquidate the entire $5 million principal early under the fraudulent guise of paying for my intensive long-term psychiatric care. It was a breathtakingly evil financial masterpiece. They were going to steal the massive fortune my real parents lovingly set aside for my future and use it to pay off violent criminals. They would use the leftover millions to fund Jessica's insatiable appetite for designer clothes, luxury island vacations, and exclusive country club memberships. While I was locked away in a residential mental health facility, stripped of my basic human rights and my true identity. I looked up through my fake tears and carefully studied their faces. Brenda looked completely impatient, tapping her manicured nails on the table. Marcus was bouncing his leg nervously, his eyes darting anxiously toward the heavy steel door. Jessica was already looking down at her glowing phone screen, probably browsing for expensive real estate in tropical locations. They honestly believed they had completely outsmarted me. They thought I was just a naive, frightened black woman who would sign away her soul just to avoid spending a single night in a dirty local jail cell. They had no idea they were sitting in a room with a woman who routinely dismantled multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement rings for breakfast. I knew exactly how federal wire fraud laws worked. I knew that the absolute second Marcus used this fraudulent document to initiate a financial transfer across state lines, he would trigger a massive, unforgiving federal offense, the kind of crime that brings federal agents knocking. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and picked up the silver pen. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and picked up the silver pen. My hand hovered over the signature line, trembling just enough to make my performance entirely convincing. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly bored now that the hard work of breaking my spirit was seemingly over. She looked at Marcus and whispered that the smell of the holding cell was making her incredibly nauseous. She rubbed her perfectly flat stomach and announced she needed to step outside for some fresh air for the sake of the baby. Marcus nodded lovingly and told her to go wait in the precinct lobby. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind her, leaving me alone with Marcus Brenda and their high-priced lawyer. I kept my eyes focused on the paper, pretending to read the final paragraph, but my mind was already anticipating their next move. I knew Jessica was not just going to sit quietly in the lobby. She needed to cement her status as the ultimate victim before I ever had a chance to walk out of this police station and tell my side of the story. Out in the brightly lit hallway, Jessica pulled her expensive smartphone from her designer purse. She opened her social media application and hit the live broadcast button, aiming the camera perfectly to capture her tear-stained face and the police station logo on the wall behind her. She began a deeply calculated and incredibly malicious smear campaign. She told her hundreds of followers that her heart was completely shattered tonight. She wept openly, claiming that I had suffered a violent psychotic break earlier in the day. She told the camera that I had physically attacked our aging mother Brenda, pushing her violently against a wall and screaming absolute delusions about being kidnapped. She choked back a fake sob and told her audience that my violent outburst did not stop there. She claimed I had maliciously threatened to completely destroy Marcus and evict her from her home knowing she was currently pregnant with a miracle baby. She pleaded for prayers from the community, saying they were currently at the police station trying to get me the intensive psychiatric help I desperately needed. She tagged the official page of our church and every prominent elder in the congregation. Within minutes, the video began spreading like wildfire across the entire local community network. Back inside the holding cell, the lawyer pushed a small plastic bin across the metal table. It contained my personal belongings that the police had confiscated when I was arrested: my car keys, my wallet, and my phone. The lawyer offered a smug smile and told me I could have my life back as soon as the ink dried on the document. I stared at the silver pen in my hand, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. Suddenly, the screen of my phone lit up inside the plastic bin. A notification popped up, then another and another. The phone began vibrating violently against the hard plastic, continuous and unrelenting. I glanced down at the bright screen. I saw a text message from First Lady Higgins telling me I was a complete monster and a disgrace to the entire congregation. Another message popped up from my former youth group leader, telling me to repent for laying my hands on the wonderful woman who raised me. Dozens of hateful messages poured in, calling me ungrateful, psychotic, and dangerous. Someone wrote that I deserved to be locked away in an asylum for threatening a helpless pregnant woman. I realized exactly what Jessica had done. She had launched a massive preemptive strike to completely assassinate my character in the public eye. She wanted to ensure that even if I tried to tell the truth about the missing trust fund or the kidnapping, no one in our entire community would ever believe a single word I said. They would look at me and only see the unstable, violent woman Jessica had carefully invented. I looked at the flood of notifications, feeling a strange sense of absolute freedom. If the entire church community was so eager to believe her outrageous lies without ever asking for my side of the story, then they were never my family or my genuine friends to begin with. Their quick judgment completely severed the last remaining ties I had to my old life. I did not feel sad or rejected. I felt completely unburdened. Jessica thought she was destroying my reputation, but she was actually handing me the greatest gift possible. She was making it incredibly easy for me to burn this entire fake life to the ground and walk away without a single ounce of lingering guilt. I looked back up at Brenda and Marcus. They were watching my phone vibrate with identical expressions of smug satisfaction. They thought the public shaming would finally break my spirit. I looked right back at them, keeping my expression entirely blank. I tightened my grip on the silver pen and pressed the tip firmly against the signature line. I tightened my grip on the silver pen and pressed the tip firmly against the signature line. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy paper as I carefully spelled out the name they had given me. Maya. It felt like I was signing a death warrant, but I knew exactly whose death warrant it was. I finished the signature with a deliberate flourish and gently placed the pen back onto the metal table. Marcus did not even wait for me to pull my hand away. He snatched the document so fast he almost tore the thick parchment. He quickly scanned the bottom of the page, verifying my signature was legible and legally binding. A massive breath of relief escaped his chest, and the nervous sweat on his forehead seemed to dry instantly. He slid the paper over to the expensive lawyer, who meticulously inspected the ink before slipping it safely into his pristine leather briefcase. Brenda looked down at me with a sickeningly triumphant smile. She reached out and patted my shoulder with fake maternal warmth, telling me I had finally made the right decision for the family. The heavy steel door swung open again, and Jessica strolled back into the holding cell. The miraculous transformation was genuinely astounding. Her previous nausea had completely vanished, and her eyes were perfectly dry without a single trace of the dramatic tears she had just broadcasted to the entire world. She saw the lawyer snap his briefcase shut, and a bright, greedy smile immediately spread across her face. She practically skipped over to Marcus, linking her arm through his and resting her head on his shoulder. The lawyer turned to the young police officer standing guard outside the door and nodded. The officer stepped inside and unlocked my handcuffs. The cold metal snapped open, leaving deep red bracelets bruised into my skin. The lawyer informed the officer that the family had reached a private resolution, and all grand theft auto charges were officially being dropped by the complainant. The officer looked confused by the sudden change of heart, but he simply nodded and instructed me to collect my personal belongings from the plastic bin. I grabbed my car keys, my wallet, and my phone, shoving them deep into my jacket pockets. The police escorted us out of the holding area and into the main lobby of the precinct. My family walked a few paces ahead of me, chatting happily with the lawyer about their upcoming weekend plans. They did not look back at me once. We reached the double-glass doors of the precinct exit. Outside, a torrential downpour had started. Heavy sheets of cold rain battered the concrete pavement, and the wind howled through the dark streets. Marcus turned to me as he pushed the heavy glass door open. He looked at the pouring rain and then looked back at my thin jacket. He offered a cruel, mocking smirk and told me my car was still impounded in the police lot, so I would have to figure out my own way home. He suggested I take a long walk in the rain to cool off my unstable mind. Jessica laughed a high-pitched grating sound and told me to be careful in the dark. Brenda simply pulled her designer trench coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the storm under the protection of a large black umbrella held by Marcus. I stood under the small concrete awning of the precinct and watched them walk to their imported luxury SUV. They climbed inside, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and the heavy vehicle aggressively pulled away from the curb, intentionally driving through a massive puddle and splashing cold, dirty water directly onto my shoes. The red taillights faded into the dark, rainy night, leaving me completely alone. The second their car disappeared from view, the defeated posture I had been holding completely evaporated. I straightened my spine and rolled my shoulders back, shaking off the lingering tension of the holding cell. The rain blew sideways, hitting my face, but I did not feel the cold. I only felt pure, unadulterated ice coursing through my veins. The terrified hostage was gone forever. The senior financial auditor had fully returned to the driver's seat. I reached into the hidden lining of my purse and pulled out a secure encrypted burner phone. In my line of work, dealing with corporate whistleblowers and massive financial fraud required absolute security. I powered on the device and quickly dialed a number I had committed to memory years ago. It rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. I spoke clearly into the receiver. Agent Miller, it is Maya. I am cashing in that favor you owe me. I need you to open a priority file right now. I just handed a massive wire fraud syndicate the exact tool they need to steal $5 million across state lines. They think they won, but I'm about to hand you the biggest federal indictment of your career. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone back into the hidden pocket of my purse. The cold rain continued to pour, but I barely noticed it as I walked the 5 blocks back to my apartment. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. I unlocked the deadbolt to my front door and stepped inside, peeling off my soaking wet jacket. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I walked straight into my home office and sat down at my desk. The dual monitors glowed brightly in the dark room, illuminating the keyboard. I went straight to work. I knew Marcus incredibly well. He was arrogant, but also desperate. Desperation makes people sloppy, and Marcus was drowning in debt to dangerous people. He would not wait until Monday morning to test out his brand new legal weapon. He would use that power of attorney tonight to access the Atlanta Trust Fund portal. I opened my encrypted network and bypassed the standard security firewalls. As a senior auditor, I had high-level security clearances that allowed me to monitor financial mainframes in real time. I located the exact digital portal for the trust fund managed by the Atlanta Financial Institution. Instead of locking him out, I decided to lay out a massive digital welcome mat. I began writing a custom script to create a mirrored server. This is a technique we call a honeypot in the cybersecurity world. It acts exactly like the real banking portal, but it is actually a highly sophisticated trap designed to capture every single piece of data entered by the user. I routed the primary login page directly through my newly created honeypot server. I typed furiously line after line of complex code, ensuring the trap was completely invisible to the naked eye. I programmed the server to capture every single keystroke Marcus made. It would record his exact geographical location using his device's IP address and log the unique hardware address of his computer. Most importantly, the script was designed to meticulously trace any destination routing numbers he entered. If he tried to move a single penny of that $5 million principal, the honeypot would instantly capture the receiving bank account details. It would document the offshore shell companies and the dummy corporations he planned to use to hide all the stolen money. Once the tracking parameters were perfectly set, I needed to ensure the evidence was immediately actionable for federal prosecution. In cases of massive wire fraud, the chain of custody for digital evidence is absolutely critical. If a defense attorney can prove the data was tampered with, the entire case falls apart. To prevent this, I established a direct secure pipeline between my honeypot server and the cyber fraud unit at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I linked the output data stream directly to the secure portal Agent Miller had just authorized for me. Every piece of information Marcus typed would be legally logged, time-stamped, and automatically forwarded to the federal database in real time. He would literally be handing his confession directly to the FBI with every single click of his mouse. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a deep breath. The digital snare was perfectly set. It was an invisible web of federal wire fraud statutes waiting patiently for its prey. I watched the black screen of my monitor waiting for the trap to spring. I knew Marcus and Jessica were probably sitting in their luxury living room right now, pouring expensive champagne and celebrating their brilliant victory. They thought they had successfully broken the difficult sister and secured their lavish future. They believed that piece of paper with my forced signature gave them the ultimate key to the kingdom. They had no idea they were actually unlocking the heavy doors of a federal prison. A soft ping echoed through the quiet room. A line of green text scrolled across my dark monitor. Connection established. Another ping sounded, followed by a rapid stream of data illuminating the screen. User login initiated. Marcus had not even waited an hour. He was already online trying to access the primary account dashboard. I watched the screen as his IP address populated, confirming the location was exactly his home address. Then came the uploaded document. He was submitting a digital scan of the power of attorney to the bank server to verify his legal authority over the account. He was formally establishing his intent to take control of the assets. The final piece of the federal puzzle was falling perfectly into place. I reached for my phone to book a red-eye flight. It was finally time to go to Atlanta and meet the people who had been searching for me my entire life. I packed a small bag and my secure laptop. I ordered a ride to the airport and watched the wet streets blur past. The terminal was empty at this early hour, allowing me to move through security unnoticed. I boarded the red-eye flight to Atlanta, taking a window seat near the back. The cabin lights dimmed as we took off. I rested my forehead against the cold plastic window and watched the city lights fade into total blackness below. For the first time in 33 years, I was finally heading toward my true home. The hum of the jet engine was the only sound keeping me company as my mind raced through the incredible events of the last 2 days. I had lost everything I thought I knew, but I was about to gain the truth. When the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, the morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the city. I grabbed my bag and walked through the bustling airport terminal. I saw Chloe waiting for me near the baggage claim. She was wearing a simple beige trench coat, and her eyes were scanning the crowd frantically. When she finally saw me, she let out a loud gasp and ran toward me, pulling me into a desperate, tight embrace. I hugged her back, feeling a strange but profound sense of genuine sisterhood. She guided me out to her car, and we drove toward the affluent northern suburbs of Atlanta. We pulled up to a massive set of wrought iron gates that slowly swung open, revealing a breathtaking brick estate surrounded by ancient oak trees. Chloe parked the car and gently grabbed my hand, telling me that our mother was waiting inside. My heart hammered heavily in my chest as we walked through the grand double doors of the house. The foyer was spectacular, but my eyes were immediately drawn to the frail woman sitting in a plush armchair near the large living room window. She looked so incredibly small, wrapped in a thick woven blanket. Chloe gently guided me into the room. The woman slowly turned her head, and our eyes finally met. I saw my own reflection staring back at me in her age-tired face. Chloe whispered that our mother had suffered a mild stroke several years ago, directly caused by the unbearable stress of losing me. The woman reached out a trembling hand toward me, tears streaming freely down her pale cheeks. I stepped forward and fell to my knees in front of her chair, letting her frail fingers gently touch the side of my face. She whispered my name over and over again like a sacred prayer. She told me about my father. She explained how he had spent every single waking moment of his life tirelessly searching for me. He hired private investigators, chased thousands of dead-end leads, and never gave up hope. She told me the endless stress and crushing heartbreak eventually destroyed his health. He suffered a massive fatal heart attack 10 years ago, dying with my childhood photograph clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. Brenda did not just steal my childhood, she effectively murdered my father. She robbed a loving husband of his life and left a grieving mother paralyzed by endless sorrow, all so she could fund a comfortable lifestyle for herself and her arrogant son. Chloe helped our mother rest and then asked if I wanted to see my room. I nodded silently and followed her up the grand sweeping staircase. We walked down a long carpeted hallway until we reached a white wooden door at the very end. Chloe turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. I stepped over the threshold and stopped breathing. The room was perfectly preserved as it was 25 years ago. Soft yellow wallpaper lined the room, and a small white toddler bed sat perfectly made in the corner. Stuffed animals rested untouched on a wooden rocking chair. A small yellow sundress hung carefully on the closet door. It was a perfectly frozen monument to a stolen life. I walked over to the bed and picked up a small plush bear. I held it tightly against my chest. The crushing sadness that had been building inside me suddenly crystallized. It hardened into an absolutely indestructible armor of pure vengeance. I was no longer just fighting for my own stolen bank accounts. I was fighting for the father who died looking for me. I was fighting for the mother who lost her health to endless grief. I placed the bear onto the bed and slowly turned around toward Chloe. I told her it was time to finalize our ultimate trap. I walked out of the bedroom and headed downstairs with Chloe following closely behind me. We said a temporary goodbye to our mother, promising we would return as soon as the nightmare was completely over. We drove straight to the Atlanta Police Department headquarters. Chloe had already contacted the lead detective who originally worked my kidnapping case 25 years ago. Detective Vance was an older man with silver hair and tired eyes. When we walked into his office, he stood up from his desk and stared at me in complete silence. He looked at the old missing person file sitting open on his desk and then looked back at my face. He shook his head in absolute disbelief, telling us he never thought he would see this cold case solved in his lifetime. I sat down and calmly explained everything that had happened over the last 48 hours. I told him about Brenda and the fake life she built from stolen money. I told him about Marcus and the fraudulent power of attorney they forced me to sign in a dirty holding cell. Detective Vance immediately called in a forensic technician. The technician swabbed the inside of my cheek and rushed the sample to the state crime lab for an expedited rapid DNA match. They needed absolute scientific proof to proceed with federal kidnapping charges against Brenda, and they needed it today. While we waited in the detective's office, I opened my secure laptop and connected to the encrypted server. The honeypot I built last night was running perfectly in the background. My screen was currently displaying a quiet dashboard of green text, indicating no activity. The police station was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit and the distant ringing of telephones. Detective Vance brought us cups of black coffee. He told me he was already drafting the preliminary arrest warrants, but they needed the DNA confirmation to get a federal judge to sign them. I nodded and took a sip of the bitter coffee. Suddenly a loud, sharp ping echoed from my laptop speakers. The screen flashed bright red, illuminating the small office. The status bar changed from idle to active. Data transfer Marcus was finally making his move. I set my coffee cup down and pulled the laptop closer to the edge of the desk. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated the deep tracking protocols Marcus had just logged into the Atlanta bank portal, using the forged power of attorney document. He navigated directly to the Generational Trust Fund dashboard. I watched in real time as his unique IP address requested a complete liquidation of the principal balance. The system displayed the total exact amount, $5,200,000. Marcus did not hesitate for a single second. He entered a destination routing number and clicked the transfer button. The honeypot server captured every single packet of data instantly. I ran a rapid trace on the routing number he provided. He was not just sending it to his local retail bank. He was routing the massive fortune through a corporate shell company registered in Delaware before pushing it toward a highly secure offshore account in the Caribbean. It was a classic, sophisticated laundering technique meant to hide the stolen money from state authorities and tax auditors. But Marcus was not dealing with state authorities anymore. The absolute second he clicked that transfer button, and the digital currency crossed the Georgia state line. He committed a massive, undeniable federal crime. Moving fraudulently obtained funds across state borders elevated the entire situation to federal wire fraud. The mandatory minimum sentence for a crime of this massive magnitude was 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Without the possibility of early parole, I watched the progress bar on my screen as the transaction fully completed. The trap was officially armed and permanently locked. I quickly compiled the captured keystrokes. the IP address logs, and the offshore routing details into a heavily encrypted digital file. I sent the entire package directly to Agent Miller at the FBI Cyber Fraud Division. Just as the email confirmed, sent Detective Vance walked back into the office holding a white piece of paper. He had a tight, grim smile on his weathered face. The rapid DNA results were officially back from the crime lab. The genetic match to my biological parents was an absolute 99.9% certainty. There was no longer a single shadow of a doubt. I was legally and scientifically the stolen child of the Caldwell family. Detective Vance slammed the heavy file shut and told me he had enough hard evidence to put Brenda away for the rest of her natural life. He asked me how I wanted to proceed with the arrests. I looked at the dark screen of my laptop and thought about the lavish company launch party Marcus was hosting tomorrow evening. I thought about Jessica and her malicious viral video designed to destroy my reputation. I thought about Brenda parading around the church like a pious saint, stood up and closed my laptop, slipping it safely into my bag. I told the detective I was flying back home tonight. I told him they were having a massive celebration tomorrow, and it would be a terrible shame if the FBI did not make a grand entrance. I thanked Detective Vance and promised to see him tomorrow. Chloe drove me to the airport. The flight back home was a stark contrast to my journey to Atlanta. I was no longer a terrified woman searching for answers. I was a weapon fully loaded and pointed directly at the people who had destroyed my family. I landed and took a cab back to my apartment. I finally unlocked my front door and stepped inside. As I dropped my keys, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new notification on the screen. It was a text message from Jessica. She simply could not resist the urge to gloat. She needed to twist the knife one last time to secure her feeling of absolute victory. I opened the message and read her cruel words. She wrote, "We are moving to Hawaii next week. You can keep the old house assuming the bank does not foreclose on it. Get help. Maya." I stared at the glowing screen. I could picture her manicured nails tapping against her expensive smartphone. I imagined Marcus standing beside her, pouring them both tall glasses of imported champagne, toasting to the massive $5 million fortune they believed was currently sitting safely in their offshore Caribbean account. I knew they thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They believed the money was entirely untraceable and that I was a powerless, broken woman who would quietly fade away into poverty. I walked into my dark living room and sat down on the edge of the sofa. I did not feel a single ounce of anger reading her highly malicious text message. I only felt a cold, thrilling sense of absolute anticipation. I typed my reply slowly, ensuring every word carried the exact weight I intended. I wrote, "I would not miss Marcus's company launch party tomorrow for the world. Wear something expensive." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the glass coffee table. I did not wait for her reply. I knew my message would instantly ruin her celebratory champagne, but I did not care. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. If I was going to crash a high society corporate event and publicly dismantle a massive criminal empire, I needed to look exactly the part. I bypassed the conservative gray suits I normally wore to corporate audits. I reached all the way to the back of the closet and pulled out a sharp, tailored emerald green power suit. I had bought it years ago, but never had the courage to actually wear it. Because Brenda always told me bright colors made me look incredibly desperate for attention. She always wanted me to remain invisible. But tomorrow night, I wanted every single eye in that grand ballroom firmly fixed on me. The next morning, I woke up incredibly early. I spent the entire day meticulously preparing my digital arsenal. I plugged a secure titanium flash drive into my computer and began transferring the highly classified files. I copied the encrypted FBI wire fraud logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the official rapid DNA test results directly onto the drive. I formatted the complex financial documents into a clean, easily readable presentation. As a professional auditor, I knew perfectly well that average people did not understand complex banking jargon. I needed to present Marcus's massive crimes in a way that the church pastors, the community, elders, and his wealthy private investors would understand instantly. I created a visual slide deck of pure, undeniable financial ruin. Early in the afternoon, I called Agent Miller at the FBI Cyber Fraud Division to confirm the final operational details. He assured me his tactical team was already fully briefed and actively positioning plainclothes agents around the luxury downtown hotel where Marcus was hosting his lavish event. He also confirmed that Detective Vance had officially secured the federal kidnapping warrants and was currently flying in from Atlanta to execute the arrest personally. The federal net was completely drawn tight. There was absolutely no way out for any of them. As the sun finally began to set, casting long dark shadows across my apartment floor, I took a long hot shower. I styled my hair perfectly and applied my makeup with an incredibly steady hand. I slipped into the tailored emerald green suit, adjusting the sharp lapels. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the obedient, terrified daughter Brenda had carefully designed. She was Maya Caldwell, the rightful legal heir to the Atlanta Trust Fund, and she was ready to collect every single debt owed to her. I grabbed my car keys, the heavy titanium flash drive, and walked straight out the door. The drive to the downtown luxury hotel took exactly 20 minutes, but it felt like the culminating journey of my entire life. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped onto the long red carpet that had been obnoxiously rolled out just for this specific event. The entrance was flanked by massive floral arrangements of white roses and glowing neon signs, proudly displaying the sleek modern logo of Marcus's completely fraudulent tech startup. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors and entered the grand lobby. The muffled sound of a live jazz band and the continuous clinking of crystal glasses echoed loudly from the main ballroom down the hall. I did not rush my steps. I walked with the slow, calculated, and measured pace of a trained executioner carrying the final undeniable verdict. When I reached the arched entrance of the ballroom, I paused in the shadows near a massive marble pillar to take in the sheer audacity of the scene playing out in front of me. Marcus had spared absolutely no expense for his grand illusion. He had rented the most exclusive and expensive venue in the entire city. Giant crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the massive crowd. Waiters dressed in pristine white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the room, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with top-shelf imported champagne and expensive caviar hors d'oeuvres. At the very front of the room, a massive high-definition projection screen was set up, waiting for Marcus to deliver his keynote presentation to his investors. The room was packed to its absolute maximum capacity. I immediately spotted our entire church congregation mingling near the open bar. The exact same people who had flooded my phone with vicious, hateful text messages just 24 hours ago were now happily drinking expensive alcohol paid for entirely by my stolen inheritance. First Lady Higgins stood near the center of the room laughing loudly and holding a crystal flute of champagne, her judgment of me completely forgotten in the face of free luxury. And then I saw them. The three architects of my lifelong misery. They were completely basking in the absolute peak of their fake social power and arrogance. Brenda was holding court near an extravagant swan ice sculpture. She was wearing a stunning custom royal blue evening gown, but it was the jewelry that instantly caught my eye. A massive glittering diamond necklace rested heavily on her collarbone, catching the light with every slight movement she made. She had matching diamond drop earrings and a brand new thick tennis bracelet. She had obviously wasted no time tapping into the newly stolen trust funds to instantly upgrade her matriarchal facade. She was completely surrounded by the senior church elders, nodding gracefully as they undoubtedly praised her for raising such an incredibly successful and generous son. She looked exactly like a queen ruling over her loyal, devoted subjects. A few feet away from her, Jessica was performing her own magnificent theatrical production. She was draped in a custom-made silk designer gown that clung perfectly to her figure. There was no visible sign of the fragile pregnancy she had so tearfully weaponized on social media the night before, but the church ladies surrounding her were fawning over her nonetheless. Jessica threw her head back in a loud, grating laugh, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her bare shoulder. She was soaking in the endless validation and praise, completely intoxicated by her newly acquired wealth. She looked over the crowd with a smug, superior expression, firmly believing she had finally secured her permanent place among the wealthy city elite. Marcus was standing near the main stage, projecting the ultimate image of a brilliant self-made tech billionaire. He wore a bespoke dark velvet tuxedo and a heavy gold watch that I knew cost more than my first car. He was vigorously shaking hands with a small group of older men wearing dark, expensive suits. These were supposedly his high-level angel investors. But with my highly trained auditor's eye, I could clearly see the tense, aggressive body language of the men he was speaking to. Their tight smiles did not reach their cold, hard eyes. These were not legitimate Silicon Valley venture capitalists. These were the violent underground loan sharks Marcus owed his very life to. He was furiously shaking their hands and pointing up at the massive projection screen, likely promising them that their massive financial returns were finally secured and ready to be transferred into their accounts. They all looked so incredibly happy. They looked completely invincible. They had successfully built a towering, shimmering castle entirely out of my stolen blood and stolen money. They genuinely believed the storm had passed and that I had been permanently silenced. They thought the fraudulent power of attorney was locked safely in a legal briefcase, and that their horrific 25-year secret was buried forever. I stood quietly in the shadows, letting the cold, righteous anger sharpen my focus into a razor edge. I adjusted the lapels of my emerald green suit and felt the heavy weight of the titanium flash drive resting safely in my pocket. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet scent of their impending destruction. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly into the bright, glowing light of the grand ballroom. I stepped out from behind the large marble pillar and walked directly into the bright, glowing light of the grand ballroom. The emerald green fabric of my suit caught the golden illumination of the crystal chandeliers. I kept my head held high and my posture straight. Projecting an aura of authority, I did not sneak into the room or hover near the edges. I walked straight down the wide center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. It only took a few seconds for the nearest guest to notice my presence. First Lady Higgins was mid-laugh when she caught sight of me. Her mouth fell open and the champagne in her crystal flute sloshed over the rim. She tapped the shoulder of the woman next to her. The whispers started instantly spreading through the massive room like a sudden violent wildfire. Heads turned one by one. The murmur of gossip grew so loud that the leader of the live jazz band noticed the massive shift in the room's energy. He awkwardly lowered his hands, signaling the musicians to stop playing. The music sputtered and died, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Brenda was the first of my family to see me. Her posture collapsed instantly. The smug smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer terror. She gripped the edge of the ice sculpture so hard her knuckles turned white. Jessica noticed the silence and turned around. Her eyes went wide with shock, and she took a step backward, hiding behind one of the church elders. Marcus looked down from the stage, his face flushed red. He had spent millions of stolen dollars to create this illusion, and my mere presence was shattering it. He regained his composure, leaning over the edge of the stage and snapping his fingers at the two security guards stationed near the front. He pointed at me and ordered them to remove the crazy, trespassing woman. He yelled to the crowd, apologizing for the interruption, claiming his sister had escaped her facility. The two security guards stepped forward to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. I did not stop walking, and I did not flinch. As the two guards reached out to grab my arms, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out my metal badge in its leather case and held it up in their faces. I spoke in a clear, commanding voice that echoed through the quiet ballroom. I identified myself as a senior federal financial auditor. Acting in coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I informed the guards that they were currently standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene and that interfering with my movement would result in immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. The two guards looked at the federal seal on my badge, looked at my completely fearless expression, and instantly froze. They slowly lowered their hands and stepped back, clearing my path completely. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Marcus let out a nervous, shaky laugh, trying desperately to save face. He told the wealthy investor standing near him that I was completely delusional and had probably bought a fake badge online. I completely ignored his pathetic attempts to control the narrative. I walked, with unwavering purpose, past the frozen security guards, past the terrified church elders, and past Brenda, who was now physically trembling. I did not even spare them a single glance. I marched straight toward the elevated audiovisual control booth located near the back corner of the grand room. A young technician wearing a black headset was sitting behind a large mixing board, looking completely overwhelmed by the sudden dramatic turn of events. I approached his desk and simply told him to stand up and step aside. He took one look at my federal badge and immediately scrambled out of his chair, retreating to the far wall. I took his seat and pulled the heavy titanium flash drive from my jacket pocket. I plugged it directly into the master computer terminal. The system recognized the encrypted drive instantly. I quickly bypassed Marcus' original presentation software, closing out his carefully designed slideshow. With one decisive click of my mouse, the giant glowing logo of his fraudulent tech startup vanished completely from the massive high-definition projection screens at the front of the room. The screens went pitch black for a fraction of a second, plunging the front of the ballroom into shadows. The crowd murmured in confusion, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive shoes. I reached forward and grabbed the master microphone, pulling it close to my mouth. My trap was perfectly set, and it was time to show the entire world exactly who these people truly were. I pressed the execute button on the control console. The massive projection screens behind Marcus flashed back to life. Instead of his sleek, modern corporate logo, the screens were filled with glaring red banking ledgers. The rows of financial data were blown up to massive proportions, making the staggering negative balances and fraudulent accounts impossible for anyone in the room to miss or ignore. I lifted the master microphone, and my voice echoed powerfully across the silent ballroom. I introduced myself as Maya Caldwell, a senior federal financial auditor. I told the audience they were gathered here tonight under completely false pretenses. I pointed directly at Marcus, who was standing frozen on the stage under the harsh stage lights. I announced that the man standing before them was not a brilliant tech entrepreneur, but a desperate criminal operating a massive money laundering syndicate. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. First Lady Higgins dropped her champagne glass, completely shattering it against the marble floor. I clicked the mouse to advance the slide deck. A complex flowchart appeared on the screens detailing the exact origins of his startup funding. I explained that legitimate tech companies secure their initial capital through rigorous venture capital firms and board-approved seed funding. I projected his internal company records showing that his business had generated absolutely zero revenue since its inception. He had no proprietary software developers and no actual commercial product to sell. His entire operation was nothing more than a hollow shell designed solely to clean dirty money. The lavish downtown office space, the imported luxury cars, and this very launch party were all completely funded by illicit cash. I advanced to the next slide, projecting a series of highly incriminating offshore bank statements. I turned my attention to the small group of older men standing near the front of the stage. I spoke directly to them, explaining that I knew exactly who they were and exactly how much Marcus owed them. I displayed the exorbitant interest rates and the violent collection timelines attached to his massive illicit loans. I told the entire room that these men were not elite angel investors but dangerous underground loan sharks. I projected the fake accounting ledgers Marcus had been sending them, proving he had been artificially inflating his numbers to buy himself more time. The older men suddenly looked furious, glaring violently at Marcus. Marcus was sweating profusely, backing away from them until his back hit the projection screen. The illusion of his elite corporate status was rapidly disintegrating right in front of their eyes. I did not stop there. I clicked the mouse one more time, projecting the final and most devastating piece of evidence. The screens displayed the exact digital wire transfer Marcus had executed just a few hours ago from his home computer. I walked the audience through the complex web of dummy corporations registered in Delaware, tracing the money trail directly to a secure offshore account in the Caribbean. I stated the exact amount of the transfer for everyone to hear loudly and clearly. $5,200,000. I looked right at Jessica, who was trembling near the ice sculpture. I told the angry loan sharks that Marcus had absolutely no intention of ever paying them back their money. He was planning to use this massive stolen fortune to flee to Hawaii with his wife and leave his dangerous debts entirely behind. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal sent a massive shockwave through the ballroom. The loan sharks began shouting aggressively at Marcus, demanding their money immediately. Several of them stepped forward onto the stage, cornering him completely. The wealthy private investors, who had actually considered writing him legitimate checks, realized they had narrowly avoided a massive financial disaster. They immediately pulled out their phones to call their legal teams. The church elders who had praised Brenda and Marcus just moments ago were now staring at them with absolute disgust and horror. Brenda covered her face with her hands, trying to hide from the devastating public humiliation. Jessica tried to shrink into the background, attempting to physically distance herself from her husband. But the spotlight of federal guilt was shining directly on her as well. Marcus looked like a terrified animal, desperately looking for an exit. He yelled at the security guards to stop me, but the guards he had hired were now blocking the doors, unwilling to let a prime federal suspect escape the room. The entire fraudulent empire they had spent 25 years building was completely reduced to ash in less than 5 minutes. I stood in the control booth watching the utter chaos unfold. My surgical financial takedown was entirely perfect, leaving no room for denial or escape. I slowly lowered the microphone and prepared for the final phase of the operation. Down on the floor, Jessica suddenly realized that the lavish billionaire lifestyle she had been fiercely clinging to was evaporating into thin air before her very eyes. Her custom designer gown and sparkling diamond jewelry meant absolutely nothing if her husband was publicly exposed as a massive criminal fraud. Seeing the violent loan sharks closing in on Marcus and the wealthy investors backing away, in absolute disgust, Jessica desperately resorted to the absolute only defensive strategy she had left in her arsenal. She played her ultimate trump card. She dramatically collapsed onto the polished marble floor near the melting swan ice sculpture. She began hyperventilating loudly, clutching her chest and gasping for air as if she was experiencing a severe life-threatening medical emergency. Several church elders who were just moments ago staring at her with pure disgust instinctively rushed forward to help her. Jessica batted their hands away and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly up at me in the audio-visual control booth. She unleashed an ear-piercing scream, demanding that somebody immediately call the police to arrest me. She yelled that I was an insane, aggressive black woman who was violently ruining her innocent husband's life and severely threatening the safety of her unborn child. She wept hysterically, thrashing on the floor and screaming that I had completely lost my mind and needed to be dragged away in heavy handcuffs. It was a terrifyingly calculated display of manufactured fragility. Jessica knew exactly how to weaponize her tears, to instantly paint me as the dangerous, unhinged aggressor, and herself as the helpless, innocent victim. She wanted the wealthy crowd to forget all the hard financial evidence I had just presented and focus entirely on her highly theatrical distress. A few of the older guests completely fell for the performance and began frantically dialing emergency numbers on their cell phones. Marcus, seeing his wife's dramatic distraction, tried to use the sudden commotion to slowly edge his way toward the side exit of the stage. He thought the crowd was finally turning against me, and that the local police would arrive any second to throw me back into a dirty holding cell to silence my completely valid accusations forever. Jessica continued her deafening screams, looking up at me with a quick momentary flash of pure vicious triumph hidden perfectly behind her fake tears. She genuinely believed she had successfully regained total control of the narrative, but her triumphant delusion was violently shattered. Just a few short seconds later, the massive oak doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom did not just open, they burst inward with a deafening crash that echoed heavily over the screaming, panicked crowd. Jessica stopped crying instantly, a smug, arrogant smile beginning to form on her lips as she fully expected to see local beat cops rushing in to aggressively tackle me to the ground. She sat up, adjusting her silk gown, ready to play the deeply relieved victim. But the people pouring through the grand entrance were not local patrol officers responding to a noise complaint. It was a massive, highly coordinated team of federal agents, over a dozen men and women, wearing heavy, dark tactical vests, emblazoned with bright yellow letters, spelling FBI, stormed aggressively into the room. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, fanning out across the massive ballroom and instantly securing every single exit to ensure absolutely no one could leave the premises. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man I immediately recognized as Agent Miller, walked straight down the wide center aisle. He raised his hands and shouted with a booming, authoritative voice, ordering every single person in the room to stay exactly where they were and keep their hands clearly visible. The entire ballroom instantly descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. First Lady Higgins let out a terrified shriek and ducked behind a velvet chair, spilling her expensive champagne onto her shoes. The angry loan sharks who had been aggressively cornering Marcus suddenly froze, completely terrified of catching federal attention. They dropped their hands and tried to quietly blend into the panicking crowd. The wealthy private investors threw their hands up in the air, loudly protesting their innocence and declaring they had no official ties to the fraudulent company. Jessica remained sitting on the cold marble floor, her mouth hanging wide open in sheer, unadulterated shock. The fake tears completely dried up as she stared in pure, unblinking horror at the tactical federal agents surrounding the room. Her calculated performance of white fragility was completely useless against a fully executed federal raid. Marcus saw the heavy tactical vests and completely panicked. He abandoned his wife, abandoned his fake company, and made a desperate dash toward the kitchen doors, hoping to escape before armed agents could physically reach the stage. Marcus sprinted toward the swinging wooden doors of the hotel kitchen, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the polished marble floor. He pushed past terrified waiters and shoved a heavy silver tray of champagne glasses out of his way, sending shattering crystal flying in every direction. He genuinely believed he could slip through the service corridors and disappear into the dark city streets. But federal agents do not leave blind spots during a coordinated raid. Just as his hands hit the brass push plates of the kitchen doors, two massive tactical agents stepped directly into his path. Marcus tried to pivot and run the other way, but one of the agents lunged forward, grabbing him by the lapels of his bespoke velvet tuxedo. The agent lifted Marcus entirely off his feet and slammed him violently face first onto a long catering table. The heavy wooden table groaned under the sudden impact. Expensive caviar appetizers and floral centerpieces crashed to the floor around him. Marcus let out a sharp cry of pain as the agent pinned his arms roughly behind his back. The distinct sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. The agent yanked him up by his collar, forcing him to stand and face the crowd he had just tried to swindle. I walked down the small carpeted steps from the audiovisual control booth, leaving the dark room behind me. The sea of panicking guests instinctively parted as I moved, forming a wide, clear path for me to walk through. No one dared to speak a single word. They simply stared at me in absolute stunned silence. I walked straight down the center aisle, my emerald green suit cutting a sharp contrast against the dark formal wear of the captive audience. I did not rush. I took my time approaching the front of the room where Marcus was currently being held firmly by two heavily armed federal agents. His velvet tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with spilled food. A small cut on his forehead was bleeding slightly from where he had hit the catering table. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with absolute sheer terror. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, desperately searching my face for any sign of the sister he used to bully and manipulate. He found absolutely nothing but cold, hard justice. I stopped a few feet away from him and crossed my arms over my chest. I looked him up and down, taking in the pathetic sight of the man who had tried to steal my entire life. I spoke in a clear, calm voice, projecting my words so the entire room could hear every single syllable. I asked him if he honestly thought I would just hand over my entire financial autonomy because he locked me in a dirty holding cell for an hour. I told him he was always incredibly arrogant, but I never realized he was actually stupid enough to fall for the absolute oldest trick in the auditing playbook. He stared at me in sheer confusion, unable to comprehend how his perfect master plan had collapsed so quickly. I explained the trap to him, slowly making sure he understood the absolute permanent destruction of his life. I told him that the fraudulent power of attorney document he forced me to sign was never a surrender. It was the exact rope I intentionally handed him so he could hang himself. I explained how I went home and instantly created a mirrored digital honeypot over the Atlanta Bank portal. I watched his face drain of all remaining color as I told him that my secure server had captured every single keystroke he made. I told him the FBI had his IP address, his exact geographical location, and the routing numbers for his hidden offshore shell companies. I told him he had literally handed his entire criminal confession directly to the federal government, wrapped in a neat digital bow. I took one step closer to him, lowering my voice just slightly, so the intensity of my words hit him like a physical strike. I explained that stealing money from a family member in family court is one thing, but using fraudulent legal documents to electronically transfer over $5 million across state borders is a massive, undeniable federal offense. I told him he had committed federal wire fraud on a spectacular multi-million-dollar scale. I stared directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I informed him that the mandatory minimum sentence for a federal financial crime of this specific magnitude is 20 straight years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I reminded him that the federal system does not offer parole for good behavior. The mathematical reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. 20 years. He would be an old, broken man before he ever saw the outside of a prison wall again. His arrogant facade completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Marcus, the flashy tech CEO and the golden child of the family, completely broke down right there in front of everyone. His knees buckled entirely, forcing the two federal agents to hold him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the marble floor. He began to sob uncontrollably. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical wailing. He cried exactly like a terrified child. He begged the federal agents to let him go, swearing he would give all the money back immediately. He looked frantically over his shoulder toward his mother and his wife, desperately pleading for them to do something to save him. But Brenda and Jessica were completely frozen in their own individual terror, unable to offer him a single shred of comfort. I stood there and watched him weep openly in front of his investors and his church congregation. I did not feel a single drop of pity or remorse. He was finally paying his debt in full. As the agonizing echoes of Marcus sobbing filled the grand ballroom, my attention deliberately shifted away from his pathetic display on the floor. I turned my gaze toward the extravagant swan ice sculpture where Brenda had been standing just moments ago. The majestic matriarch who had spent the entire evening soaking up the adoration of the church elders was currently attempting a desperate, cowardly retreat. While the entire room was completely mesmerized by the dramatic downfall of her golden child. Brenda was slowly inching backward toward the heavy velvet curtains that concealed a small service corridor. She moved with agonizing caution, keeping her head down and her posture stooped, hoping the surrounding chaos would perfectly mask her silent escape. She genuinely thought she could just slip away into the dark night and simply disappear just like she did 25 years ago. But she had completely underestimated the absolute thoroughness of my master plan. Just as her manicured hand reached out to grasp the edge of the dark velvet curtain, the side doors adjacent to the corridor violently swung open. Brenda instantly recoiled, taking several rapid steps backward. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock as she stared at the people walking through the heavy wooden frame. It was not the local hotel security guards coming to assist her escape. It was Detective Vance from the Atlanta Police Department, dressed in a sharp dark suit with his gold badge prominently displayed on his belt. Flanking him on either side were Chloe and our biological mother, Brenda. Completely froze, her expensive diamond necklace sparkling mockingly under the bright chandelier lights. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking incredibly pale and sickly. She recognized the frail woman standing before her immediately. The woman she had worked for, the woman she had ruthlessly betrayed, the woman whose precious infant she had stolen away in the middle of a sunny afternoon. Our biological mother looked at Brenda not with the fragile weakness of a stroke survivor, but with the fierce, indestructible strength of a mother who had finally hunted down the monster who destroyed her family. Detective Vance stepped forward, closing the distance between them with long, authoritative strides. He did not lower his voice to spare her any public embarrassment. He completely commanded the room, his deep, booming voice easily cutting through the remaining murmurs of the stunned crowd. He looked Brenda directly in the eyes and officially identified her by her original legal name, the name she had buried under decades of calculated forgery and lies. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and firmly ordered her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Brenda began violently shaking, her perfect, pious church persona completely disintegrating into a million jagged pieces. She desperately looked toward the congregation that had worshipped her for years, silently begging them to intervene. But the church elders physically recoiled from her. Pastor Higgins stepped forward, his face contorted in a mixture of absolute horror and profound disgust. He demanded to know exactly what was going on. Detective Vance turned slightly toward the pastor, and the crowd projecting his voice even louder. He officially announced that he was executing a federal fugitive warrant. He declared that the woman standing before them was being placed under immediate arrest for the aggravated kidnapping of a minor 25 years ago, massive identity theft, and the grand larceny of over $3 million from a generational trust fund. The collective gasp from the church congregation was absolutely deafening. The people who had blindly followed her, the people who had sent me dozens of vicious, hateful text messages, calling me a monster, were now staring at the actual monster standing right in their midst. First, Lady Higgins physically turned her back on Brenda, shaking her head in total revulsion. The absolute worst punishment for a narcissist like Brenda was not just the impending prison sentence. It was the complete permanent loss of her pristine public image. She was no longer the devoted, loving matriarch of their community. She was a highly calculated predator who had used their sacred sanctuary as a convenient hiding place. Detective Vance grabbed her arms and roughly secured the steel handcuffs around her wrists. The sharp clicking sound echoed beautifully across the room. He began loudly reading her Miranda rights, declaring she had the right to remain silent. A right she definitely should have exercised decades ago. Brenda then finally broke completely. Her knees gave out and she collapsed against the detective, sobbing uncontrollably. She wailed, claiming she gave me a good home, but the truth was out. Nobody believed a single word she ever said anymore. Brenda slid down the detective's side until her knees hit the cold marble floor with a heavy thud. The heavy steel handcuffs forced her arms into an awkward position behind her back, but she did not care about her physical discomfort. She dragged herself forward on her knees, crawling across the polished floor until she was directly in front of me. She looked up, and the meticulously crafted mask of the pious church matriarch was completely gone. Her expensive makeup was heavily smeared across her face, mixed with genuine tears of absolute terror. Her diamond necklace hung crookedly against her chest, a mocking reminder of the wealth she was about to lose. She looked up with wide, desperate eyes and deployed the only weapon she had left in her arsenal: guilt. She tilted her head back and wailed my name, begging me to remember the past. She screamed that she was the one who was there for every milestone of my life. She yelled, "I raised you, I fed you, I gave you a home when nobody else wanted you." She possessed the delusional audacity to stand before the biological mother she violently robbed and claim she did me a favor. She wept violently, insisting that she had sacrificed her own youth to put clothes on my back and food on my table. She begged me to tell the federal agents that this was all just a massive misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to call off the detectives, claiming she made a desperate mistake out of love. I stood perfectly still, looking at the weeping woman trembling at my feet. The grand ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if the lifelong conditioning of a toxic parent would finally crack my resolve. I felt the heavy gaze of the church congregation watching me. I felt Chloe step slightly closer to me, offering her silent, unwavering support. Our biological mother stood tall, her face a mask of dignified disgust as she watched the kidnapper beg for unearned mercy. I did not need anyone to hold me up. I did not feel a single ounce of conflict or hesitation. I looked at Brenda, and I did not see a mother. I saw a massive financial liability that I was finally writing off my books forever. I saw a master manipulator who was officially bankrupt. I looked down at her with absolute zero emotion. My voice was calm, cold, and incredibly steady. I told her to stop talking because her lies had officially lost all of their purchasing power. I leaned down slightly, ensuring she heard every single syllable of my final audit. I said, "You did not raise me, Brenda. You raised a hostage. You raised a paycheck. You stole a child from a loving family just so you could tap into a $10,000 a month trust fund. You never loved me. You loved the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the endless flow of free cash my stolen identity provided. You charged me for every single plate of food and every piece of clothing by systematically draining millions of dollars from my biological parents." Brenda let out a sharp gasp, shaking her head frantically side to side, trying to deny the cold, hard math of her betrayal. But I was not finished. I straightened my posture and looked at her designer gown and her diamond jewelry. I told her that real mothers do not look at their children and see a retirement plan. Real mothers do not freeze their daughters' bank accounts and try to lock them in psychiatric wards just to steal a $5 million principal balance. I told her she was nothing but a calculated, greedy parasite who had finally run out of hosts to bleed dry. Detective Vance stepped forward, grabbing Brenda firmly by the upper arms. He hauled her roughly to her feet, ignoring her loud protests. She tried to drag her feet desperately, trying to stay near me, hoping her tears would somehow miraculously wash away decades of severe federal crimes. She looked back at me, her face twisted in pure agony, screaming my name one last time. I crossed my arms over my chest and delivered my final, completely emotionless goodbye. I said, "Enjoy your retirement in federal lockup, Brenda." Detective Vance spun her around and forcefully marched her down the center aisle of the ballroom. The congregation immediately parted, creating a wide path to avoid brushing against her. First Lady Higgins turned her face away entirely, refusing to make eye contact with the disgraced matriarch. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, severing my ties to Brenda forever. The heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind Brenda acted like a starting gun for Jessica. With her wealthy future completely evaporating before her very eyes, she realized her pristine life was officially over. She looked at Marcus, who was still weeping on the floor held up by two federal agents. All the fake love and absolute devotion she had publicly paraded around the church vanished in a single heartbeat. She instantly turned on him. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk designer gown, and rushed directly toward Agent Miller. She threw her hands up in the air and completely changed her narrative. She pointed a trembling finger at her husband and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that Marcus was a pathological liar and a highly abusive manipulator. She told the federal agent she had absolutely no idea where his money came from. She claimed he kept her entirely in the dark about the tech startup, the loan sharks, and the stolen trust fund. She played the role of the innocent, naive wife, flawlessly crying that she was just a helpless, pregnant woman caught in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. Marcus stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, staring up at his wife in sheer disbelief. The woman he had literally risked a 20-year federal prison sentence to please was currently throwing him under a massive bus without a single second of hesitation. He whispered her name, but she fiercely told him to shut his mouth. She turned back to Agent Miller, her eyes wide and overflowing with heavy tears. She unleashed her ultimate defense mechanism, the exact same white tears she had successfully used to manipulate the bank manager just yesterday morning. She begged the tall federal agent to let her leave the ballroom so she could go home and protect her unborn child from this terrifying trauma. She genuinely expected the tough federal agents to soften at the sight of a weeping, wealthy blonde woman in a designer gown. But she severely miscalculated the environment. Agent Miller did not offer her a comforting smile. He did not offer her a tissue or a chair. He stared at her with an expression of absolute stone-cold indifference. He let her finish her frantic, hysterical monologue, and then he calmly reached into the interior pocket of his heavy tactical vest. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and deliberately flattened it out on the nearest catering table right next to the shattered crystal glasses. He instructed Jessica to look very closely at the highlighted section of the document. Jessica sniffled and leaned forward, her eyes scanning the complex financial text. I watched from a few feet away, knowing exactly what that piece of paper was. Agent Miller tapped his thick finger against the bottom right corner of the page. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, explaining that the document was the official registration mandate for the offshore shell company located in the Caribbean. He pointed directly to the signature line. Jessica's highly stylized signature was printed right there in black ink. She was not just a passive beneficiary of her husband's massive crimes. She had willingly signed her name as an official co-signer and primary stakeholder on the international money laundering accounts. Agent Miller explained that the federal government does not consider primary corporate officers to be innocent, naive bystanders. The color completely drained from Jessica's face. The fake tears instantly stopped falling. She backed away from the table, shaking her head in frantic denial, claiming her husband must have forged her handwriting. But the absolute final nail in her perfectly manicured coffin was delivered by the hotel banquet manager. He nervously approached the tense circle holding a digital payment terminal. He cleared his throat and addressed Jessica directly, stating that the premium black credit card she had placed on file for the open bar and the catering deposit had just been violently declined. Jessica frantically snatched her expensive smartphone from her clutch purse. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. She opened her banking application to check her balances. I knew exactly what she was seeing, because I had briefed Agent Miller to initiate the asset freeze precisely 10 minutes ago. A massive bright red banner completely covered her screen. The federal government had officially frozen all marital assets connected to the fraudulent offshore accounts. Her checking accounts, her savings, her credit lines, and her premium investment portfolios were all completely locked. She was instantly reduced to absolute zero. She looked up from her phone, completely horrified. She had no money, no wealthy husband, no elite social status, and absolutely no way out. Agent Miller simply nodded to a female federal agent standing nearby. The agent stepped forward, grabbing Jessica's wrists and forcing them behind her back. Jessica finally let out a genuine scream of pure terror as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. She fought and thrashed, but the agent held her firmly. Her white tears had completely failed against the unforgiving reality of federal law. The federal agents marched Jessica out of the grand ballroom right behind her sobbing husband. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside painted the hotel lobby in harsh, chaotic colors. The once glamorous tech launch party was reduced to an active crime scene, and the elite guests scattered into the night desperate to immediately distance themselves from the massive public scandal. I stood in the center of the empty, ruined ballroom, breathing in the absolute silence. The lifelong war was finally over. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on a hard wooden bench inside a sterile, heavily guarded federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta. The air conditioning hummed quietly, masking the tense, anxious energy radiating from the packed gallery behind me. I was not sitting alone in the cold room. Chloe was seated firmly to my right, holding my hand tightly, while our biological mother sat on my left, projecting a quiet, dignified strength. We were dressed impeccably, presenting a united, unbreakable family front. The massive double doors at the front of the courtroom opened, and the bailiff instructed everyone to rise. The presiding federal judge was a stern, uncompromising woman with absolutely zero patience for white-collar financial predators. She took her seat behind the high mahogany bench and looked down at the defendant's table with piercing eyes. Marcus was brought out first, wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his suddenly frail frame. He had lost a significant amount of weight during his time in the county holding facility. The arrogant tech billionaire facade was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a broken man. His public defender offered a weak, pathetic plea for leniency, citing that Marcus had no prior criminal record, but the judge immediately cut him off. She looked directly at the mountain of digital forensic evidence I had meticulously provided and shook her head in sheer disgust. She stated that using a fraudulent legal document to attempt the theft of over $5 million across state lines was a crime of breathtaking, unadulterated greed. The wooden gavel slammed down with a deafening crack. Marcus was officially sentenced to 20 straight years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He did not cry this time. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely destroyed, as the armed guards hauled him away. Brenda was escorted into the courtroom next, and the transformation was genuinely shocking. Stripped of her expensive skin creams, her weekly salon hair treatments, and her stolen diamond jewelry, she looked every single bit of her actual age. Her hair was completely gray and her posture was permanently hunched. She refused to look in my direction, keeping her eyes glued to the scuffed floor of the defense area. The lead federal prosecutor laid out the entire horrific timeline of my kidnapping, detailing exactly how she had spent 25 years systematically embezzling millions of dollars from a grieving, desperate family. The judge addressed Brenda directly, calling her actions a profound, sickening violation of human trust and basic morality. She stated that stealing an innocent child for pure financial gain was an unforgivable act of pure evil. The gavel struck the block again. Brenda received a devastating 25-year sentence. Given her advanced age, it was effectively a permanent life sentence. She would draw her final breath behind thick concrete walls, completely forgotten by the world she tried to manipulate. Finally, Jessica was led into the room. She had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to sever all legal and personal ties to Marcus. She filed for an expedited divorce and hired a sleazy defense attorney, using the absolute last of her parents' drained retirement savings. She attempted to play the ultimate victim card, arguing she was heavily coerced into signing the offshore banking documents. She claimed she was just a naive pregnant housewife completely terrified of her husband's violent underground loan sharks. But the federal prosecutors completely dismantled her fragile defense. They presented a massive, undeniable trail of text messages and luxury purchase receipts, proving she was an enthusiastic and highly willing accessory to the massive wire fraud. She knew exactly where the stolen money was coming from, and she happily spent it to aggressively elevate her own social status. The judge looked right through her manufactured white tears and sentenced her to 7 hard years in a federal correctional facility. Jessica's shrill, entitled screams echoed down the long marble hallway as the bailiffs dragged her forcefully out of the courtroom. The toxic parasitic family that had suffocated me for my entire life was officially and entirely erased from society. Their remaining assets were completely seized by the federal government to pay restitution, and their names became a shameful cautionary tale whispered in the back rows of our old church congregation. I walked out of the heavy courthouse doors and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun. I took a deep, clean breath of fresh air, feeling a profound, absolute sense of genuine freedom. I linked arms with Chloe and our mother, ready to finally begin the beautiful life they had violently stolen from me. We left the concrete steps of the federal courthouse entirely behind us and never looked back. The flight back to Atlanta was entirely different from my first desperate journey. There was no anxiety, no fear of the unknown, just a quiet, profound certainty. The three of us returned to the grand brick estate, nestled in the affluent northern suburbs. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open, welcoming the rightful daughter back home where she always belonged. Now, months after the trial concluded, I find myself sitting on the expansive wrap-around porch of the Caldwell estate. The late afternoon sun filters through the ancient oak trees, casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawn. I am holding a delicate porcelain cup filled with sweet jasmine tea. The gentle breeze carries the scent of blooming magnolias, completely erasing the lingering phantom smells of Brenda's sterile bleach-scrubbed hallways. Chloe sits in a plush wicker chair beside me, laughing at a story our mother is telling us. Our mother looks years younger now. The heavy, suffocating weight of her 25-year grief has entirely lifted from her fragile shoulders. The color has returned to her cheeks, and her smile is radiant and genuine. I look at the two women sitting beside me and I finally understand the true definition of family. For 33 years, Brenda weaponized the concept of family to keep me compliant. She used the word daughter like a heavy iron chain tying me to her endless financial demands and toxic manipulation. She demanded gratitude for simply not abandoning the child she had violently stolen. Marcus and Jessica used the word sister as a convenient tool to exploit my credit score and fund their fraudulent billionaire lifestyle. They all believed that claiming me gave them the absolute right to consume me. But sitting here on this porch, I realize that true family is not about who simply claims you. It is entirely about who actually values you. True family does not see you as a monthly paycheck, a hostage, or a convenient scapegoat. They see you as a human being deserving of unconditional love and absolute respect. My father spent his entire life and his massive fortune turning over every single stone in the country just to find me. My mother survived decades of unimaginable heartbreak, just hoping she would one day see my face again. Chloe instantly risked her own safety to hand me the exact police files I needed to destroy my captors. That is what real family does. They protect you. They fight for you. I am no longer the terrified, obedient girl who tiptoed around a house filled with lies. I am no longer just a cold, calculating financial auditor hiding behind spreadsheets and corporate firewalls to avoid dealing with my own painful reality. I am Maya Caldwell. I am the daughter of a man who loved me enough to search until his dying breath. I am the sister of a woman who never stopped believing I was out there. I finally have my real name, my real identity, and the massive generational wealth that was always legally mine. The stolen funds that the federal government managed to recover from Jessica's frozen accounts and Brenda's hidden offshore shell companies were safely returned to the Caldwell Family Trust. But the money is entirely secondary. The true victory is the absolute peace I feel sitting on this porch, knowing the monsters who stole my childhood are currently sitting in small concrete cells, stripped of their names, their pride, and their freedom. I take a slow sip of my jasmine tea and look directly at you listening to my story. Sometimes the people who demand your absolute loyalty are the exact same people secretly plotting your ultimate destruction. Sometimes you have to stop being the peacekeeper and start being the auditor of your own life. You have to look at the ledgers, analyze the behaviors, and completely bankrupt the toxic people who are draining your soul. I burned a massive criminal empire to the ground using nothing but financial records and the unadulterated truth. So I have to ask you a question. Have you ever had to use the truth to destroy people who built their lives on lies? Drop your story in the comments. Like and subscribe to keep breaking generational curses. Maya's journey powerfully illustrates a difficult but vital lesson. The title of family is not a free pass for exploitation. For decades, her captors weaponized guilt obligation and the concept of familial duty to keep her compliant while they systematically drained her resources. This highlights a harsh reality that many face. Toxic people will often use the sacred bond of family as an impenetrable shield to hide their abusive behavior. They demand unconditional blind loyalty while offering only conditional transactional affection in return. The defining turning point in the narrative is not just the shocking discovery of the kidnapping, but Maya's active decision to stop playing the role of the terrified, obedient daughter. By applying her professional auditing skills to her personal life, she teaches us the profound importance of looking at our relationships through a lens of objective reality rather than emotional manipulation. We must be willing to examine the ledgers of our own lives. We have to ask ourselves hard questions. Are the people around us genuinely investing in our well-being and growth, or are they constantly making emotional, mental, and financial withdrawals? Breaking free from a deeply toxic environment requires immense courage, especially when it means dismantling the only reality you have ever known. Maya's story is an extreme example, but the core truth remains universal. We are never obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep our abusers warm. True love protects values and uplifts. It does not launch smear campaigns, manipulate your reality, or demand your life as a ransom payment. Take a close look at the relationships in your own life. Carefully audit the people who demand your loyalty, and have the courage to permanently cut ties with anyone who costs you your peace.